I'm Benjamin Chambers, and I edit the Reclaiming Futures blog, and I'm here today with Mark Lipsey of the Peabody Research Institute at Vanderbilt University. Mark, I'm happy to have you here today.
Yeah, nice talking with you.
I wanted to ask you a couple things about your latest report from the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. The first thing, can you tell me a little bit about the background, kind of what led you to develop to do the meta-analysis and to develop a tool that you're hoping that local jurisdictions can use to improve the effectiveness of their juvenile justice programs?
Well, Benjamin, I started out literally decades ago collecting the research on interventions with juvenile delinquents, sort of in the aftermath of all the nothing works literature, and thought using this new meta-analysis technique might yield some new insights. Over 20 years, we accumulated, actually we're now getting close to 700 studies with the current update. So there's really a large body of research on what's effective. We found, in fact, that lots of things are effective, contrary to that old myth about ineffective. At this point in my career, I'm less interested in cranking out more academic publications using meta-analysis, and much more interested in how we can use this large body of research to improve practice in juvenile justice. And the bridging issue is how you go from this large research base, which gives, on the surface, gives some generalities to practitioners, down to some kind of nuts and bolts practice guidelines that can actually be put in place program by program. So we've developed this tool that my colleagues call the SPEP, S-P-E-P, the standardized protocol, what is it? Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol. That basically is a set of practice guidelines for different effective programs. And now we're working with the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform as a sort of platform for disseminating and providing technical assistance for using this in conjunction with a set of other evidence-based tools that constitute a kind of a reform model for systems that want to be make better use of the evidence to essentially act smarter when they're dealing with juveniles who come into the system.
So how does this differ from, a lot of jurisdictions are aware of evidence-based programming,
Mm-hmm.
So how does this differ from that?
Well, here's the critical difference, okay? The conventional definition of an evidence-based program is a sort of brand name model program that appears on a list somewhere, a certified list, blueprints, NREP, National Registry of Effective Programs, the OJJDP model programs list, where some group has reviewed the evidence, said, okay, this passes and it's evidence-based. And that's actually good if you're going to launch a new program, or you can use one of those model programs. Okay, the evidence does give you some warrant for believing it's going to be effective, but very few of those. In the first place, there are relatively few of those programs. Very few of them are actually being used in juvenile justice systems, and there are some barriers to using them. Service providers aren't always wild about unplugging what they're currently doing and plugging in one of these model programs. Many of them are, most of them are associated with some expenses. Some of them are associated with considerable expense for the licensing, the training, and monitoring, and so on. So what we've done is not as a substitute for that, but as a complement for that, is to look at generic program categories. So think of my almost 700 studies of interventions with juvenile delinquency. They're probably, I don't count this, but I doubt that there are 50 of those, certainly no more than 100 that deal with these model programs. Well, what about the evidence from the other 500 or 600? Okay, is that not evidence that we can use in juvenile justice? But most of those are homegrown programs, generic type programs. So we categorize them. There's brand name cognitive behavioral therapy, but there's a lot of homegrown cognitive behavioral therapy. There's brand name family therapy, but there's a lot of homegrown. And it turns out when you analyze these things that there are characteristics of the more effective ones that mostly have to do with working with higher risk juveniles, with having adequate amounts of service, adequate quality of service, and particularly having programs that fit in what we call the therapeutic range. That is, they're actually oriented toward bringing about internally supported behavior change. as opposed to control or deterrence programs, boot camp, surveillance, scared straight, things that are basically bringing in external control. So the concept of this instrument is to take this larger body of evidence about types of therapeutic programs that work and provide some practice guidelines so that now in a juvenile justice context, you may already have some group therapy programs, some family therapy programs, but they're not model blueprint type programs. So rather than try and switch over, this is a tool that you can apply to assess how that existing program compares with what the research says is the most effective version of that kind of program. Now, often when we do that, we find that the programs fall short in some way, but the remedy for that is some kind of incremental improvement, not stop what you're doing and plug in a whole different model. So maybe the amount of service being provided isn't sufficient, or maybe the quality control isn't sufficient, or maybe you're investing in a more expensive program on low-risk juveniles who aren't going to benefit as much. But those are correctable things as the program evolves. So the idea is basically to expand the concept of what's evidence-based while still making use of the evidence. Does that make sense?
It certainly does, thank you. No, that sounds actually very useful. So if I were representing a local jurisdiction and I wanted to get my hands on this tool, do I just download it? What do I do?
Well, that's a kind of a complication, and that's actually where our recent initiative with the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown comes in. I'd be happy if that were possible, and I don't feel proprietary about this. It was developed with federal funds, and it's a useful tool. But it requires a certain amount of tailoring to be used effectively. It's a data-driven approach at several levels. So first, there are different sets of these relatively simple empirical practice guidelines for different types of programs. So a jurisdiction has to kind of match up its programs with the right category here of research. And we found, for instance, that there are programs out there that if you match them to the research, we would call them generic group counseling. But because maybe there's one element or two elements of cognitive behavioral therapy in there, the providers put them forward as CBT programs. Well, that's a different category that has a different level of effectiveness. So you have to kind of sort out, is this group therapy or is this group cognitive behavioral, so we match up with the right research. And that requires some knowledge of the research definitions. And then as you move down to the other parts of the data needed, you've got dosage information like duration of service and frequency of contact. You've got risk information. Well, every jurisdiction has a different information system, and some are lacking some of these things. They're not doing risk assessments, or their management information system isn't tracking amount of service for each juvenile, and so on. So it may need some work to collect the appropriate information, or it may need some tailoring to take what is in their database and adapt it to this instrument. So that's the part where some assistance is needed to really make this thing work. And the reason not to put it out on the web is for fear that people would misunderstand, start plugging in all kinds of misaligned kinds of information, and start interpreting that in ways that wouldn't be valid and would kind of defeat the purpose here. Yeah, exactly.
So how do they get that assistance, and what does that consist of?
Well, that's been a dilemma for me for some time. And the recent partnership with Shay Bilchick, who's the director at the Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, is to basically use their well-developed training platform to try and make this more readily available. So the initiative that we are launching, actually, in sort of in the wake of the overview paper that you mentioned earlier, is to set up a training program where a small number of states state juvenile justice systems teams will come in. We're going to start with 3, and I'll spend about a week at Georgetown. We kind of go through the whole scheme. Now there are other parts here besides this one tool. This tool is kind of a missing link tool. Okay, we're thinking in terms of the whole body of evidence, so how you make smart decisions using risk assessment and needs assessment and this tool for matching services and do monitoring in a framework that's It's basically an update of the earlier OJJDP comprehensive strategy for having an array of services using structured decision-making tools to match up the right service with the right kid in the most cost-effective manner. That scheme had a lot of good characteristics, but it didn't have the evidence-based program part. The best you could do in modern contemporary context is plug in one of these model programs, so we've expanded that definition. So there's a broader training package here, but all oriented toward the best evidence available for making decisions and providing effective programs to juveniles. And then that will be for these state teams. We've configured a technical assistance package that will run for approximately 18 months. It takes a while to get all this in place and kind of institutionalized. And our hope is that with that sort of launching pad and that assistance, that these state teams, these will be multidisciplinary teams of probation and judiciary and prosecutors and service providers, all the relevant players represented, that will allow them to incorporate these tools effectively and in a valid way into their systems and make good use of them. If that works out okay on the first round with 3 states, then we'll figure out how to, if there are others interested, we'll figure out how to do it with some more.
Great, great.
And the center in Georgetown, the Juvenile Justice Reform Center, they have a lot of experience networking and working with these juvenile justice systems and have done similar training models in other areas. So it's, from my standpoint, it's really a good partnership. They know how to disseminate and train. We've got some of the background in the tools. I think it's going to be very synergistic, as they say.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Mark. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, you bet. Good talking with you.